a monastic in a Tibetan Buddhist lineage. She was given the name of Jamgyal about 10 years ago when she took ordination vows. Ani translates as auntie, or auntie if you're from the Northwest, and is the title used by Tibetans to refer to their Buddhist nuns, kind of like sister is used to refer to Catholic nuns in the Americas. Ani Jamgyal's root teacher, and you'll have to help me with this pronunciation, is it Zigar Kongtrul Rinpoche?
Yeah, Zigar.
Zigar Kongtrul Rinpoche. Her teacher is a Tibetan Lama who now lives in Crestone, Colorado, where he oversees the Mangala Shribhuti Samtinling Meditation Center. How did I do?
Great.
Great, okay. The Meditation Retreat Center. After spending a year in retreat, Ani Jamgyal spoke with Rinpoche about her wish to return to New Mexico and to serve members of vulnerable communities. Rinpoche agreed and entrusted her with a daily study and practice program to support her service work right here in the Albuquerque community. I first met Ani Jamgyal through our work together at the New Mexico Faith Coalition for Immigrant Justice. So, Ani Jamgyal, First Unitarian's theological theme this month is letting go, and today specifically it's about letting go of fear. You told me a story related to this about when you were growing up in
New York.
When you were a little kid, and will you share that story with the congregation?
Sure. My babysitter took me to an amusement park one day, and we went over to the kiddie rides, and there was this one ride with little cars that had wings on them, and they were brightly painted, and I thought that looked pretty good, so she helped me get in it, put my seatbelt on, and the ride started, and we started going around in a circle, and then unexpectedly it went up into the air, because it was actually, those were little airplanes, not cars with wings on them. So that just terrified me, being up in the air like that. And so there was this stick in front of me, you're sitting in your little seat, and then there's a stick, and I just grabbed it and pulled it toward me because I was so scared, and my plane just went woo, like that. So I was completely terrified.
I love this story because the fear was causing you to grip tighter onto the stick, so you had to let go of your fear in order to let go of the stick and come down.
Yeah, if only that's what had happened. But instead, I just held tight to it, screamed through the whole thing, and then sobbed in my babysitter's arms afterwards.
I feel so much compassion for that little girl on that ride. Because fear, it has valuable information to share with us, but sometimes it's hard to sort out what kind of fear we're experiencing, right? Whether it's fear that's meant to preserve our lives, and I think you must have been scared for your life on that ride.
I was.
Yeah. Like fear of an aggressive dog would be another example of that mortal kind of fear. And I would put giant insects in that category too, personally. A couple of weeks ago, Dan Lilly's wise friend Kishan shared the service with him, and Kishan shared a story about a time when they used to live in India. This was at the 9:30 service. Kishan told the story of opening the shower curtain one day to find a cockroach the size of a piano, which which I love. And that's really something, because Nabil has some really giant cockroaches, right? And Kishan said it was kind of moving its wings, getting ready to fly. And Kishan, who was raised Catholic, reacted by saying the Hail Mary. I wasn't raised Catholic, but I could imagine just doing the exact same thing. So fear can be a friend. When our lives are in danger, it spurs us to action. But when our lives are not in danger, in my experience, fear can still be a friend. It can be a friend that teaches us about ourselves and helps us to develop more expansive souls. Kishan demonstrated this in that same story by being brave enough to look the cockroach in the eye, and here I'll say I wish no cockroach were big enough to have visible eyes. But Kishan noticed that cockroach was also scared, and then also noticed that as a gender non-conforming person of color, they could also relate to being seen as undesirable by others. In my own life, I think social anxiety can be one example of fear that teaches me. Many people feel anxious in certain kinds of social situations, and I do too sometimes. For example, when my husband and I travel to Colombia, where he's from, I find myself in a completely different social context. Not only does his family belong to a different culture, but they also belong to a higher social class than my family of origin. And so I often feel like I just don't understand the rules of interaction, and this makes me super anxious. At the root of that anxiety, though, is a fear of being rejected. And so in response to that, for many years, I used to just kind of clam up around his family. And I think they experienced me as not particularly friendly. So it totally backfired. And eventually I decided to look my fear in the eye, and I decided to set it aside. And instead of worrying about how I was coming across, I would just focus on accepting and loving them and being curious about them without any attachment to wanting to be liked myself. And that changed everything.
Oh, I bet. It would be hard not to like somebody, someone who accepts and loves you and is curious about you.
Right.
Yeah.
And the people that I've most admired, the ones who seem to have those expansive souls, are people who practice acceptance and love and curiosity. But the trick is, of course, when we're in the middle of fear, we do kind of grip onto it, right? And we have to let go in order to be curious about it and to turn it over and examine it. So what does Buddhism say about these things?
Well, I guess first I'd just like to say Buddha taught what he had to say, right? He taught what he taught. And he always said afterwards, but don't take my word for it, check it out for yourself. And I think his words were something more like, as I give you these teachings as though they are gold, you must, as a goldsmith, examine them yourself, examine them closely to see if they hold true in your own life and your own life experiences and your observations of other people's lives. So he wasn't at all advocating hero worship or blind faith. So whenever I say anything about, my understanding of Buddhist teachings, they come from my own experience and my understanding, rather than this is what, the ideology is. So it's not really, I can't really speak from a dogmatic perspective. So that's my qualifying comment about saying anything about Buddhism. But I guess in order to talk about letting go of fear, you have to talk about letting go in general. And from my own experience, I can talk about how not letting go feels and how that feeling impacts my interactions with other people. And I know how not letting go functions in my own life and how harmful not letting go has been for me and for the people I've engaged with when I'm not letting go. And so in Buddhist philosophy, not letting go is actually a form of aggression. And I have found that to be the case, that whenever I don't let go, I end up harming myself and everybody else in the interaction. So a very simple sort of pragmatic example of that is like if I'm holding on to something physical, really holding on tight, my finger, all the muscles in my finger start to cramp, and then my whole hand cramps, and then my arms, all those muscles are, start to seize up, and then it goes into my neck, up my back of my head, down my back, and before I know it, I have that pain in my shoulder blade just from holding on to something. And even when I'm just thinking certain kinds of thoughts, the same thing happens. I get tension in my face, it travels down my neck and into my back. And the reason that the body's set up to, register pain is because muscles are designed to hold on to something, do some kind of work, and then let go. They're designed to contract and release, not to just stay contracted. So in general, muscles are designed to, deal with a world that's constantly changing, where everything around us is constantly moving. So to have something static happening usually sends off some kind of alarm in our system.
This reminds me of the way that fear is such an embodied sensation. Like we tend to think of it as being up here in our heads, but actually it's something that we experience in our bodies. Like I know that sometimes I won't even realize fear is what I'm experiencing until I check in with my body. Like I might think I'm experiencing indignance or anger or maybe powerlessness, because fear can masquerade as those things. It likes to put on other feelings on top of itself. But then when I ask, what's happening in my body right now? What's my body telling me? I might notice my stomach is hurting, My shoulders are tense. My breathing is faster than normal. I have a feeling of adrenaline going on. And it might turn out I'm not angry, like, for example, at my child coming home after curfew without texting me first. It might turn out really I'm scared because I love them, and that makes us vulnerable when we love people, and I don't want anything to happen to them. But the body knows what's really going on, right? We can train ourselves to tune in and notice what's happening, and of course, the breath is useful for this. If we can get into the habit of noticing our breath, it can help us recenter in our bodies and in the present and be awake to what's going on.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the reasons for shamatha, which is a meditation where you just focus on the sensation of breathing, how it feels to, the in-breath feels, how the ex-breath, the exhalation feels. Once you drop into your body and you realize how you're feeling, and say you notice that you're feeling fear, the question then is how to let go of that feeling. How do you let go of something when you're holding on to it so tightly, especially if you're holding on to an idea or a belief about somebody or something? Why would you let go of something that you know is true? Like, you're just convinced it's the case. So, you have to kind of look at something there. So it helps to kind of track it back from, if you're holding on to tightly, it means you're not letting go, right? Because you're holding on. So you must be holding on to something. And it helps to begin to look at what it is you're holding on to. You can't hold on to air, for example, or water. You can only hold on to something solid. So that's true of our minds as well. They only hold on to something that we think is solid and unchanging, that like this is how it is. So something you notice in meditation practice, even when you're just trying to focus on your breath, is that your thoughts aren't solid. They're just like, they're just going on and on and on. You can do that for 5 or 10 minutes before you realize, oh, right, the breath. And then you come back to the breathing process. So we actually have to put a lot of effort into creating thoughts and beliefs that we think are solid. And then we have to repeat them over and over, right? We have to tell everybody our story to make it really super solid. And that takes also, it's a kind of a constructing process. Like typically fear, anxiety, and hatred, they're ideas and feelings and thoughts that are kind of constructed by our own minds with little bits and pieces of perception. Like there's these little sea creatures that they make their shells out of the stuff lying around on the bottom of the ocean. So if they find a little piece of smoothed glass, or they find a little piece of somebody else's broken shell, and they find some sand, they'll bring those together, and then they secrete a liquid glue, and then the glue hardens. And so they just keep doing that until they have their little shell that they live in. And these are very elaborate, fascinating, and unique structures. Like everyone makes a slightly different structure. And we do the same thing in our minds with tidbits of facts and rumors, assumptions, myths, observations. We glue them together using our prevailing mood and our unconscious habits. Like you notice when you're falling in love with somebody, you can have one set of details about them, and if you're in love, the glue that comes out and makes this home where your idea is that this person is just a phenomenal person. If you're in a state of conflict with the exact same set of facts, a whole different glue comes out, right? And you make this like totally different shaped house to live in, and your mind is like, this person's kind of a jerk. And so, and then you tell, like I said, you tell your story repeatedly. Sometimes you lie in bed at night going over and over your story just to make it solid. But you have to actually do a lot of work to make that idea so solid. It doesn't matter whether the idea is pleasing or comforting or it produces anxiety. The thing that they all have in common is that you can hold on to them. And once we have something to hold on to, that's what we do. We just hold on to it. No matter, even if it's, something that causes us anxiety, and, the hypothalamus dings on the pituitary releases a bunch of stuff into the blood that signals to your adrenal glands to let out the cortisol and the adrenaline, and then, you're basically bathing your internal organs in cortisol, which ends up creating chronic illnesses. and still will hold on to the idea rather than let go of it.
It's harder to feel confident about that when we picture ourselves as slimy little sea creatures, just putting together our story shells.
Totally, it is. So back to the topic.
Okay.
What does that have to do with letting go of fear? The point is, it's harder to let go of something if you believe that it's true and you believe that it's solid. So from the Buddhist perspective, the work isn't like forcing your fingers to let go of this thing, but to actually look at what you're holding on to and to realize it really isn't so solid, which is like what Thich Nhat Hanh was doing with that contemplation on a piece of paper. The piece of paper isn't this inherently existent piece of paper. It's made up of everything in the universe. And if you do that with enough things, things start falling apart a little bit in your mind. Everything doesn't seem so, the way it looks to you at first glance. If you apply that same kind of analysis to somebody that you're hating on, you might start off with orange hair and tiny hands, but oh, that's not actually here. That just passed through my mind. But if you trace that all back, you do actually find that they're made up of how they're, what experiences they went through as children, how they were hurt and bullied as children. And then you keep going, and you end up with stardust and space and gravity. And, you realize that there are many experiences they haven't had yet. They're constantly changing too. And so you have more room for that, for them to become somebody else.
Let's hope. Yeah, I heard that. Let's hope. Amen. In Unitarian Universalism, our seventh principle is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And what you're describing reminds me of that principle. I think this is kind of a different take, but it's related. Remembering that I'm part of something larger than myself often helps me when I'm feeling afraid. For example, when I get nervous about public speaking, which I still do. Right? Do you?
Oh, no.
I don't believe her. I find that it really helps me to remember that I'm actually doing it for a larger purpose. It is not really about me or whether I'm perfect or not, and remembering that makes me feel braver. Ani, you and I met at the Faith Coalition where we were working on immigrant justice. That feels like just an overwhelming issue. I realized the other day, I marched in my first immigration justice protest 25 years ago when anti-immigrant voices were cranking up a terrible atmosphere of fear in my home state of Oregon. Pregnant, undocumented women were afraid to go to the hospital because some hospitals were turning people into INS, which is what we had before we had ICE. I mean, imagine giving birth without a midwife just because you're afraid officers will barge into your hospital room and drag you away. It's inhumane to put women in that position. And today, our border is this big, increasingly militarized zone with thousands of people who have fled violence, who are there seeking asylum, just stuck in limbo on the other side without the access to their legal right to ask for asylum, without shelter, without medical care, without enough food and basic necessities. There's children there. I mean, it's clearly a humanitarian crisis, but our president named it a national emergency and ordered the military to react, and that is just one of so many issues in our country. So how do you link this conversation today to that reality?
Well, definitely the suffering imposed by our political system and its failings, the people that make up that system, is creating undue suffering for so many dear people. And standing by and feeling helpless in the face of the enormity of this suffering is itself also a suffering. And when I ponder what's my greatest fear, it's when it, creeps up on me, it's that we will collectively be so paralyzed by our own fear and by the enormity of the moment that as a people we won't rise up to the challenge of engaging what's actually happening here in our community, in our state, in our nation, on our planet. And when that fear can really just reach up and grab me by the throat and choke me, really leaving me short of breath and kind of panicky, like, what if we don't do something about this? Then my fantasies start to involve smuggling people across the border. I think of driving my truck down there, breaking kids out of detention, SWAT teams, unruly mobs storming the White House and occupying Congress and demanding action. And then, then I take a breath, and another one, and a third one. And just until I'm back here in my body, in this space, contemplating what's the next thing that I can do? What's the best thing that I can do in my community, in the circle of friends that I have, and the people with whom I work? And I really like that seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism. I have to read it again. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I think that really speaks to it. Like the sun, as powerful as it is, cannot make a piece of paper by itself, and yet all those other elements are needed, and yet the sun also is needed. It may be helpless in that it can't do it alone, but it actually is necessary. And in that same way, as small and seemingly, insignificant as our individual contributions may be, in the enormity of it all, that we each make a contribution is actually essential. So it's a paradox that requires us to have faith. And what I mean by faith is confidence in the interdependent nature of the unseeable and unknowable whole in which we're embedded. So when I get way out here and I'm looking at the whole, the breathing helps me drop back down into the little corner of that place that I am, where I can act and do the part that my little tiny part, which is insignificant and yet also essential, I have to do that. So that's how I encourage others, myself and others, to participate in a way that's feasible, that's doable, and that's possible, rather than getting caught up in the enormity of it. Just take a breath, take 3 breaths, come back to your reality, and then proceed from there.
I think there's so much beauty in that, that we don't have to save the whole world all at once, and we can't. But that makes the present a goal in and of itself, and a lot of beauty happens right there. It reminds me of Mr. Rogers telling kids in times of danger or crisis to look for the helpers, right? Because there's always helpers there. That's one of the beautiful things in the present that's unfolding. So I want to circle back to the issue of immigration because that's how we met. And there are a lot of ways that our congregation can get involved in immigration justice. First Unitarian still provides sanctuary accompaniment at First Congregational Church, which means volunteers go and take shifts to be there in person, accompanying a man who has taken refuge there to avoid an unjust and random deportation order. UUs can support the Border Servant Corps, which is down in Las Cruces, and they're providing some humanitarian relief right there at the border. We can volunteer in court accompaniment, accompanying immigrants to court dates to help ensure that they're not surprise deported when they're showing up to take part in the legal process. We can work with asylum seekers who've been granted temporary entry into the U.S., those few that get that permission to come in while their cases are considered. And we need volunteers right now with our ESL and citizenship classes, just to name a few things that people can do. So our Immigrant Justice Task Force helps put congregation members in touch with those organizations that are looking for volunteers, including right here. And you can stop by the connections table in the foyer on your way out if you want to give them your contact information, and they'll reach out to you. Ani Jamgyal, thank you so much for being here today. Can I give you a hug?